So, Chapter 5, the Early Society in East Asia. So, the Yellow River, aka in Chinese, it's the Huanghe. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation like I usually do, but oh well. It's 3,000 miles, stretching from Tibet to the Yellow Sea. It deposits fertile, light-colored soil known as loess. This will allow for the rise of agriculture. It does periodically flood as the loess accumulates on the bottom, therefore raising water levels. Therefore, it has earned the nickname China's Sorrow. It will now around this region you get the farming of millet, which would prove a very key crop later on, as well as you get eventually wheat and barley, which imported from Mesopotamia. So around 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, we get agricultural villages in the middle region of the Yellow River Valley. They had painted pottery, bronze tools, agriculture, and you also had agriculture of rice along the Yangzi in the southern part. So it wasn't just the Yellow River Society, it was also in the Yangzi. Earliest dynasties. So we get the semi-legendary Shyah, which existed around 2200 BCE. A hereditary monarchy. It's one of its most famous myths is that of Sage King Yu, who controls the flood, who implements flood control. This was interesting because of the fact that instead of depicting this horrible story of say a flood destroying everything or a cruel guy, it instead depicts a leader who decides to be selfless and help his people. And you also get the idea of social harmony that still exists in China to this day. Then you have the Shang, which existed from 1766 to 1122 BCE. Now you notice something. How did they get these exact dates? Well, Chinese scholars at the time were very keen on recording their history. Therefore, they accurately. I wouldn't say completely accurately because there was evidently plenty of bias gone into the system, but they did keep diligent records on their history, and therefore that's why we have a pleasure of having exact years instead of basically just rounding off, saying circa this, circa that. Then that was followed by the Zhou, which exists from 1122 to 2256 BCE. This is a map of the various dynasties: the Shyah here, the Shang here, and the Zhou here. So the Shang Dynasty took advantage of Western imports to push aside the Shyah, and these Avengers were horse-drawn chariots, which were, unsurprisingly, came from Indo-Europeans in the Tarim Basin. They had bronze metallurgy. This allowed the state to have a total monopoly over the metal because bronze requires copper and tin. Copper's quite common, but tin is not. Therefore, we could control the tin supplies and, as a result, control the bronze supplies. They had large armies and had political organization with a network of fortified cities that were loyal to the center, but there was no central bureaucracy. The capital would move 6 times due to various invasions, rebellions, whatnot, and they had elaborate pounded earth city walls. Now, due to her hierarchical social structures, you did have burials that did depend on how you were buried would often depend on your social class. When a member of the ruling class died, they would often kill off close member, their slaves, their family members, and their hunting companions and friends, in order to ensure that they continue with them into the afterlife. And basically form of sacrificial victims. These are just some examples of who those sacrificial victims were, as I mentioned before. This was later replaced by statuary or monumental replacements, like say statues of human beings rather than actual human beings. And then we get the Zhou Dynasty, existing from 1122 to 256 BCE. They had developed cheap iron weaponry, which allows them to end the Shang monopoly on bronze and fuss weapons. So thus they could build up their own arsenals quickly and over for the Shang. They were toughened by fighting nomads to the east, therefore they had military experience. And they invented, and interestingly, they also invented this new concept called the mandate of heaven that justified them overthrowing the Shang. It basically said that fate or heaven is on the side of the new leaders in the dynastic cycle, allowing the new emperor, to become the son of heaven, or the intermediary between earth and heaven. Now, if the leader proved a terrible leader, he loses the mandate of heaven and passes on to the next leader or the next dynasty. Now, due to the Zhou's large size, they experimented something called a decentralized authority, where the local rulers were entrusted with power as long as they paid their taxes and didn't overthrow the main leader. However, strategic measures were used for a while. Due to this decentralized leadership style, it allows for the building of regional powers, basically allowing, now if you wonder what is a cap, it's basically demonstrates the relationship between the three main classes you often see in these civilizations: king, aristocrat, and peasant. The reason why the A is capital is because due to this decentralized authority, the aristocrats could gain enormous amounts of power. With this increasing local independence, they refused to pay Zhou taxes, which is obviously problematic, because if you don't have taxes, well, then how the heck are you supposed to build a state? Because of the fact that iron is so common, you can't really have a monopoly over it, so the regional powers can start building up their own arsenals. Northern invaders weakened the Zhou Dynasty beginning around 8th century BCE, and internal dissent, and you start to have internal dissent, ultimately culminating in the period of the Warring States, lasting from 403 to 221 BCE, when China is basically embroiled in this violent, bloody civil war between factions as they compete for power. And this is basically a map of China during the Warring States period. As we can see there are various powers competing for power. There's no central authority, and it's just chaos at that point. Social order. The ruling class had great advantages, elaborate palace compounds, luxurious lifestyle. They were supported by the agricultural surplus and tax revenues. They were defended by a monopoly of bronze weaponry until the Zhou comes around. Until the Zhou Dynasty, as I mentioned before, because you can't have a monopoly over iron when everyone can access it. And they had hereditary privilege. There was a large class of semi-servile peasants, slave class, mostly war captives, and there was evidence of long-distance trade and fussy the merchant class. Now, interestingly, merchants have actually historically been seen as parasitic in China. In the society, you have extra devotion to family in the form of ancestor veneration. Ancestor spirits were seen as guardian angels, therefore you should have prayed to them in order to ensure success and safety in your life. Because of the fact that they were the connection of the spiritual world to the physical world, the father would actually perform the rites rather than the priestly class, therefore you had an absence of a religious class in China. As a result, this relative secularism remains to this day. Also, because the father is the ritual head of the family, you do get a patriarchal society. You did have some individual female leaders early on, but it fades later in the Shang and Zhou dynasties to the rise of large states. Matrilineal becomes patrilineal descent. So, oracle bones, which came about in the Shang dynasty, were a form of divination, or trying to predict the future. It was definitely better than reading entrails, where you cut open an animal and read its guts. That's it takes a while and it's kind of disgusting. It was used as communication with the spirit world, or determining the future, as I mentioned before, or by writing a question on animal bones or turtle shells, throwing it into a fire, and then examining the cracks for omens. Now, within these oracle bones, you do see the beginnings of Chinese script. You see the early pictograph. You see examples of early pictographs that will later evolve into ideographs. And Chinese characters as a result. Due to the fact there was a lack of phonemes, or like a particular, or like an alphabet based around sound, this would have a huge impact on China. Now, you have another group playing a role in China. It's the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. I'm pretty sure around this time you're getting to notice that Central Asia, despite the fact that you might not know much about it, plays a central role in, no pun intended, a central role in history. So they would have an interesting relationship in Chinese. They would sometimes work with them, sometimes work against them. They would trade with them or raid them. They were basically truckers. They would move quite frequently. They were horse people because they relied on horses they got from the Eurasian steppe. Now, like I said before, the Yellow River Society isn't the only society that exists around this time. You have a society developing on the Yangzi, or the Chang Jiang, which means Long River, in the south. This area was excellent for rice cultivation. You had complex irrigation systems developing. And so ancient China was definitely more than just Shyah, Shang, and Zhou. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed. Hopefully that was helpful to you.